The November wind howled through the gaps in Margaret O'Sullivan's cabin walls like a banshee mourning the dead. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and stirred the thin soup in her pot, watching the last precious vegetables from her garden dance in the watery broth. 3 months had passed since the mine collapse took her husband Sean, and winter was settling over Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory, with the merciless grip of a creditor collecting debts. Margaret counted the coins in her leather pouch for the 4th time that morning. 2 silver dollars and some copper pennies. Enough for another week's worth of flour, maybe some salt pork if she was careful. The townspeople had been kind enough in those first weeks after Sean's death, bringing casseroles and offering condolences, but charity has a way of drying up when your own family needs feeding. She stepped onto her small wooden porch, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. The sun hung low and pale in the grey sky, offering little warmth to the frost-covered landscape. Down the main street, she could see the familiar bustle of morning activity. Men heading to the mine shaft, women hanging laundry that would freeze stiff before it dried, children bundled in coats too large chasing after stray chickens. But something caught her eye near the old cottonwood at the edge of town. A figure sat hunched against the massive trunk, barely visible except for the dark hair that contrasted sharply with the snow-dusted ground. Margaret squinted, her green eyes adjusting to the distance. It was a woman, she realized, and by her stillness either sleeping or worse. Margaret's heart clenched with recognition of desperation. She knew that particular way of sitting, the careful conservation of energy, the protective curl of the body trying to hold on to whatever warmth remained. She'd seen it in her own reflection just yesterday morning. Without conscious thought, she found herself walking toward the figure. As she drew closer, details became clearer. The woman was native, Lakota, most likely, based on the beadwork visible on her worn leather dress. Her face was gaunt, her lips tinged blue with cold. Margaret could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest. Grateful the woman still breathed. "Ma'am?" Margaret called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, are you well?" Dark eyes opened, alert despite their weariness. The woman looked up at Margaret with a mixture of wariness and resignation that spoke of too many encounters with hostility. She was perhaps 30 years old, with high cheekbones and the kind of dignified bearing that poverty couldn't quite erase. "I mean no harm," Margaret continued, her Irish accent thickening as it always did when she was nervous. "You look like you could use some warmth." The woman's gaze traveled over Margaret's patched dress and worn boots, seeming to catalogue the signs of shared hardship. When she spoke, her English was clear but carefully pronounced, as if each word required thought. "I do not wish to bring trouble to your town." "Trouble?" Margaret knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through her thin skirt. "The only trouble I see is a woman sitting in the snow when there's a blizzard coming. I'm Margaret O'Sullivan." "Aiyana," the woman replied after a moment's hesitation. "It means eternal blossom in my language, though I feel more like winter sage these days." Margaret smiled at the gentle humor despite the circumstances. "Well, Aiyana, eternal blossoms need tending in winter. Have you eaten today?" Aiyana's slight shake of the head was answer enough. Margaret felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. She had bread at home, exactly 2 loaves that needed to last until she could afford more flour. Sharing would mean her own hunger would come sooner and sharper, but looking into Aiyana's eyes, she saw something that made the choice simple. She saw Sean's face the day he'd given his last silver dollar to help a stranger's sick child, even though they needed medicine themselves. She saw her own mother, who'd shared soup with neighbors during the potato famine, even when her own children cried with empty bellies. "Come with me," Margaret said, standing and extending her hand. "I've got fresh bread and a fire that's warmer than this wind." Aiyana hesitated, her eyes searching Margaret's face for deception or pity. Finding neither, she accepted the offered hand and rose gracefully despite her obvious weakness. As they walked toward the cabin, Margaret noticed the subtle stares from townspeople beginning their daily routines. Mrs. Henderson stopped hanging laundry to watch, her disapproval as visible as the frost on her window panes. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, paused in his work to frown at the sight of the 2 women together. Margaret lifted her chin and kept walking. Let them stare. She knew something about being judged by people who'd never walked in your shoes. Inside the warm cabin, Aiyana's composure finally cracked slightly as the heat hit her. She swayed on her feet, and Margaret quickly guided her to the single chair by the fire. "Sit now and warm yourself properly," Margaret said, pulling the good quilt, the one her mother had sent from Boston, around Aiyana's shoulders. "I'll get you something to eat." She moved to the small kitchen area and began slicing one of her precious loaves. The bread was good. She'd learned to bake from her grandmother and took pride in her skill. As she spread the last of her butter on the thick slices, she felt a strange lightness in her chest, as if sharing her meager stores somehow multiplied them rather than diminished them. When she turned back, she found Aiyana watching her with an expression of profound surprise, as if kindness from a stranger was something she'd forgotten existed. "Why?" Aiyana asked simply. Margaret set the plate in her lap and poured the last of her real tea, not the chicory substitute, into a chipped cup. "Because we're both widows in a hard winter, and that makes us sisters of a sort." Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows and promising the storm to come. But inside Margaret O'Sullivan's small cabin, two women who should have been enemies according to the rules of their world shared bread and began the first fragile threads of an unlikely friendship. The blizzard arrived with the fury of an angry god, transforming Willow Creek into a world of white chaos. Snow pelted against Margaret's windows like thrown pebbles, and the wind howled with such force that the small cabin shuddered on its foundation. By evening, the drifts had piled waist-high against the door, effectively trapping both women inside. Margaret watched Aiyana from across the small room as she carefully sipped the last of the tea. The Lakota woman had said little since accepting the bread, but her eyes had gradually lost that wary, hunted look. The warmth and food had brought color back to her cheeks, revealing the striking bone structure that spoke of both strength and nobility. "This storm will last 2 days, maybe 3, Margaret said, banking the fire for the night. "You're welcome to stay until it passes. The floor by the hearth is warmer than anywhere else you'll find in this weather." Aiyana set down her empty cup with careful precision. "You show great kindness to a stranger. In my tribe, we say that the Creator tests our hearts by sending those in need to our doors." "My grandmother used to say something similar," Margaret replied, settling into her chair with her mending. "She'd tell us that angels sometimes come disguised as beggars, testing whether we'd share our last crust of bread." "Your grandmother sounds wise." "She was that." Margaret's needle paused in its work as memories surfaced. She lived through the famine in Ireland, watched her neighbors die while the landlords exported grain to England. She always said that surviving something like that changes you, makes you see the difference between what you need and what you want. Aiyana nodded slowly. "Hunger is a teacher that makes all people the same color." The simple truth of it settled between them like a bridge spanning two worlds. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, an unexpected warmth was growing that had nothing to do with the fire. "May I ask," Margaret ventured carefully, "what brought you to Willow Creek? It's not exactly on the main trails." Aiyana's hands stilled in her lap. For a moment, Margaret thought she wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, she began to speak. "My husband was called Lakota. It means friend to everyone. He was a warrior, but also a peacemaker. When the soldiers came to our village last spring, he tried to negotiate, to find a way for our people to stay on the land where our ancestors are buried." Her voice grew distant, as if she were seeing those days again. "The young warriors wanted to fight. The elders wanted to flee. Lakota stood in the middle, trying to build a bridge with words." Margaret's mending forgotten, she leaned forward. "What happened?" "There was a misunderstanding. A nervous young soldier, a quick movement from one of our warriors. The shooting started before anyone could stop it." Aiyana's fingers traced the beadwork on her dress. A wedding dress, Margaret realized. Lakota was killed trying to shield the women and children. "Sweet Mary," Margaret whispered. "I'm so sorry. After the battle, those of us who survived were scattered. My husband's brother wanted me to go west with his family, to join the tribes in the Montana Territory. But she paused, struggling with the words. "I could not leave the place where Lakota fell. I have been living in the hills, coming down to the town only when I must, trying to survive until I could decide what to do with the rest of my life." Margaret set aside her mending entirely. "That's why you were by the cottonwood. You've been watching the town, trying to work up courage to ask for help. I was not sure I would be welcome. Your people and mine have not been friendly in recent months." "Some haven't," Margaret agreed honestly. "But people are just people, Aiyana. Most are decent enough when you get past their fear and ignorance." "Is that what you did? Get past your fear?" Margaret considered this. "I suppose I recognized something in you. The way you were sitting there, so careful with your strength, so tired but still holding your dignity intact. I saw myself in you, truth be told." She rose and moved to the small trunk beside her bed, withdrawing a daguerreotype in a simple frame. She handed it to Aiyana, who studied the image of a handsome man with kind eyes and a miner's calloused hands. That's my Sean. Lost him in September when part of the mine ceiling came down. He was trying to help another man get free when the rest fell. Margaret's voice steadied as she spoke, the way it did when she'd told the story enough times. We'd been married 8 years, and I thought I knew what my life would be. Then suddenly I was alone in a place where I knew few people well, trying to figure out how to survive on my own. Aiyana studied the photograph carefully before handing it back. He has gentle eyes, like someone who would share his bread with strangers. He would have liked you, Margaret said with certainty. Sean believed that kindness was the only thing that made life bearable. He used to say that we're all just walking each other home. The wind rattled the windows again, but somehow it seemed less threatening now. Aiyana wrapped the quilt more closely around her shoulders and gazed into the fire. In my tribe, when someone dies, we believe their spirit travels along a path of stars to join the ancestors. But sometimes, when the death is sudden or violent, the spirit gets confused and stays close to earth, trying to finish what was left undone. Do you think that's why you couldn't leave? That Dakota's spirit is still here? Aiyana shook her head. I think maybe it was my spirit that was lost. I could not see how to live without him, so I stayed in the place where we were last together. But sitting here now sharing food and warmth with you? She paused, searching for the right words. I remember that there are still reasons to keep walking. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Sean used to tell me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form. Maybe it becomes the kindness we show to others, the compassion we offer to strangers. Maybe that is why the Creator brought us together in this storm, Aiyana said softly, to remind us both that we are not as alone as we thought. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the small town, burying familiar landmarks and transforming the landscape into something alien and treacherous. But inside Margaret O'Sullivan's cabin, 2 widows from different worlds had found something precious in their shared grief, the beginning of hope and the first stirrings of a friendship that would defy every expectation their communities held. The storm broke on the 3rd morning, with the sudden clarity that only comes after nature has exhausted its fury. Margaret woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows and the blessed silence of still air. Beside the dying embers of the fire, Aiyana was already awake, sitting quietly with the quilt wrapped around her shoulders like a ceremonial robe. Good morning, Margaret said, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping in her chair. Sounds like the world's gone quiet again. The storm has moved on, Aiyana agreed, but her voice carried a note of reluctance. I should go soon, before your neighbors begin to wonder. Margaret paused in the act of rekindling the fire. Wonder about what? About why a white woman would shelter an Indian through a blizzard. In my experience, such kindness often brings trouble to the one who offers it. The words stung because Margaret knew they held truth. She'd seen how quickly compassion could be twisted into suspicion in frontier towns, where fear ran as deep as the winter frost. But the thought of Aiyana walking back out into the snow-covered wilderness, alone and underfed, made her stomach clench. Let them wonder, she said firmly, adding kindling to the coals. I'll not turn you out into the cold because some people have narrow minds. But even as she spoke, Margaret could hear voices outside, the sounds of neighbors digging out from the storm, calling to each other across the drifts. Soon enough, someone would notice the 2 sets of footprints leading to her door, and only one set belonging to her. The knock came before they'd finished their morning meal of cornbread and weak coffee. Margaret set down her cup with careful deliberation and met Aiyana's knowing look. Margaret, you all right in there? The voice belonged to Pastor Williams, and it carried the tone of official concern that made Margaret's jaw tighten. She opened the door to find not just the pastor, but also Mayor Hutchins and 3 other men from the town council, all bundled in heavy coats and wearing expressions of determined righteousness. Behind them, she could see several women clustered at a respectful distance, Mrs. Henderson prominent among them, with her arms crossed and her mouth set in disapproving lines. Pastor Williams, Margaret said evenly. Gentlemen, rather early for social calls, isn't it? We heard you had company during the storm, Mayor Hutchins said, his pale eyes trying to see past her into the cabin. Some folks are concerned. Concerned about what exactly? Pastor Williams cleared his throat. Margaret, we understand you've been through a difficult time with Sean's passing, and grief can sometimes cloud our judgment about proper Christian behavior. Are you suggesting that offering shelter during a blizzard isn't Christian behavior, Pastor? The slight rebuke in her tone made him flush. Of course not, but there are appropriate ways to help the less fortunate, and having a savage in your home overnight, that woman has a name, Margaret interrupted, her Irish temper flaring despite her efforts to stay calm. "And she's no more savage than any of us trying to survive in this wilderness. Now see here, Margaret." Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, using the tone he typically reserved for unruly children. "We all respect your charitable nature, but you have to think about what this looks like. A white woman, alone, entertaining an Indian in her home. People talk. Let them talk," Margaret replied, but she could feel Aiyana moving behind her, probably gathering her things to leave. "It's not just talk we're worried about," said Pete Morrison, the owner of the general store. "You start showing kindness to one of them, and before you know it, you've got a whole tribe camping on your doorstep. We've got families to protect. That woman lost her husband the same way I lost mine. He died protecting others. If you can't see the Christian duty in helping a fellow widow, then maybe you need to spend more time reading your Bibles and less time gossiping." Pastor Williams's face reddened further. "Margaret, I think your grief has affected your reasoning. Perhaps it would be best if you came to stay with the Hendersons for a while, until you're thinking more clearly." The condescension in his voice was the final straw. Margaret stepped fully onto her porch, forcing the men to take a step back. "My thinking is perfectly clear, Pastor. Clear enough to see that you're more concerned with appearances than with actual Christian charity." "Now you listen here," Mayor Hutchins began, but he was interrupted by Aiyana's quiet voice from behind Margaret. "I will go now. I do not wish to bring trouble to one who has shown me kindness." Margaret turned to see Aiyana standing in the doorway, her few possessions wrapped in a bundle. She'd braided her hair and straightened her dress, wearing her dignity like armor against the stares of the townspeople. "You don't have to go," Margaret said firmly. "This is my home and you're welcome in it." "Thank you," Aiyana replied, and Margaret heard layers of meaning in those simple words. "But I have taken enough of your warmth. It is time I found my own path." She stepped past Margaret and faced the group of men with calm composure. "I am Aiyana, daughter of Chief Running Bear, widow of the warrior Lakota. I mean no harm to your town or your people. I ask only to be allowed to leave in peace." The men shuffled uncomfortably under her steady gaze. Whatever they had expected, defiance perhaps or cowering fear, her quiet dignity clearly wasn't it. That is, you're free to go, of course," Pastor William stammered. "We just want to ensure everyone's safety." "My husband always said that true safety comes from understanding, not from fear," Aiyana replied. "But I see that wisdom is not universal." She turned back to Margaret, and for a moment the watching crowd might as well have been invisible. "Thank you for sharing your bread, your fire, and your stories. I will not forget your kindness." "Nor I yours," Margaret replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'll always be welcome at my table, Aiyana." As Aiyana walked away, her footsteps sure despite the deep snow, Margaret felt something harden in her chest. She looked at the men still clustered on her porch, their faces showing various degrees of discomfort and righteous satisfaction. "I hope you're proud of yourselves," she said quietly, turning away a hungry woman because her skin's a different color than yours. "Margaret, you have to understand," Pastor Williams tried again. "I understand perfectly," she cut him off. "I understand that when it comes to showing actual Christian love, some folks are mighty selective about who deserves it." She stepped back inside and closed the door with a firm click, leaving the men to make their way home through the snow. From her window, she watched Aiyana's figure grow smaller as she walked toward the tree line, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Sean's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The town might have made their position clear, but Margaret O'Sullivan had made hers clear as well, and she suspected this was far from the end of the story, between her and the woman called Eternal Blossom. 3 weeks passed before Margaret saw Aiyana again. The isolation that followed the confrontation with the town council was more complete than she'd expected. Mrs. Henderson no longer nodded when they passed on the street. Pete Morrison served her at the general store with barely concealed hostility, charging her full price for flour that others bought at a discount. Even young Sally Cooper, who used to stop by for tea and gossip, now hurried past Margaret's cabin with her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Margaret told herself she didn't care, but the loneliness cut deeper than she'd anticipated. She'd grown accustomed to solitude since Sean's death, but this felt different. This was deliberate exclusion, a punishment for choosing compassion over conformity. On a grey December morning, as she hung laundry that would freeze before it dried, she spotted movement near the old cottonwood where she'd first found Aiyana. Her heart quickened, but when she looked more carefully, she saw it was just a deer picking through the snow for buried grass. That afternoon, however, when she returned from checking her empty rabbit snares, she found something that made her stop short. There, neatly arranged on her porch, were gifts that hadn't been there when she left. A bundle of dried herbs tied with sinew, 3 perfectly crafted arrowheads, and most remarkably, a pair of fur-lined moccasins that looked exactly her size. Margaret looked around carefully, but saw no sign of the giver. The items were beautiful, the herbs fragrant with unfamiliar but pleasant scents, the arrowheads napped with obvious skill, and the moccasins softer than anything she'd ever owned. Tucked beneath them was a small piece of birch bark with scratched symbols she couldn't read, but somehow understood as a message of gratitude. Over the following days, the gifts continued. A bundle of firewood appeared beside her door, cut to perfect lengths for her small stove. Wild turkey feathers, ideal for pillow stuffing, were tied to her fence post. Most precious of all, she began finding food: dried venison, wild onions preserved in bear fat, even a small pot of honey that tasted like wildflowers and sunshine. Margaret had never felt charity as keenly as she did now, seeing her meager supplies supplemented by someone who probably had even less than she did. But she also recognized something else in these gifts: respect. Aiyana wasn't offering pity. She was reciprocating kindness with kindness, maintaining the dignity of both giver and receiver. The question was how to respond appropriately. Margaret had little to give in return, but she had skills. She began leaving her own gifts: fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth, a knitted scarf in colors that would complement Aiyana's coloring, and small jars of her grandmother's remedy for winter coughs, honey mixed with herbs, and a splash of whiskey. This silent exchange might have continued indefinitely, but for the arrival of unexpected visitors. Margaret was kneading bread one snowy evening when she heard the thunder of approaching horses. Through her window, she saw torches bobbing in the darkness. Too many riders for a social call, moving too fast for casual travel. Her blood chilled as she recognized the grim purpose in their formation. The pounding on her door when it came was not a request. "Open up, Margaret." Mayor Hutchins' voice carried the authority of mob justice. "We need to talk." Margaret opened the door to find herself facing 8 men on horseback, their faces hard with resolve and cold. Most carried rifles, and Tom Bradley held a coiled rope that made her stomach lurch with understanding. "Where is she?" Pete Morrison demanded without preamble. "Where is who?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. "Don't play games with us," Mayor Hutchins snapped. "The Indian woman. We know she's been leaving you gifts, probably using your place as a base to scout the town for weaknesses. That's ridiculous. Aiyana has done nothing but try to survive the winter." "Aiyana?" Pastor Williams leaned forward in his saddle. "You know her name? You've been meeting with her?" Margaret realized her mistake too late, but pressed forward anyway. "I know she's a widow trying to get by, same as me. That's not a crime." "It is when she's been stealing from honest folk," Tom Bradley said grimly. "The Morrison place was broken into 3 nights ago. Food taken, nothing else. Yesterday the Coopers lost a whole side of bacon from their smokehouse." Margaret's heart sank. She knew Aiyana hadn't stolen anything. The woman had too much pride for that. But try explaining the difference between theft and the mysterious gifts appearing on Margaret's porch to men already convinced of guilt. "You've got no proof," she began. "We've got tracks," Mayor Hutchins interrupted, "leading right from the Cooper place toward this direction, and we've got witnesses who've seen smoke from a campfire up in Eagle Canyon. That's where she's been hiding. So you're planning to ride up there with guns and rope and call it justice?" "We're planning to end a problem before it gets worse," Morrison said coldly. "These people understand strength, nothing else." Margaret looked at their faces and saw the familiar mask of men who'd already made up their minds, who needed only the thinnest excuse to act on their fears and prejudices. She thought of Aiyana, alone in some canyon hideout, probably unaware that danger was riding toward her with torches and hatred. "Give me until morning," she said suddenly. "What?" "If you truly believe she's been stealing, give me until morning to bring her in. Let me talk to her. Get her to come down peacefully and face your accusations properly." The men exchanged glances. Pastor Williams was the first to speak. "Margaret, you can't be serious. It's dangerous enough that you've been associating with her. But going up into those canyons alone—" "I won't be afraid of someone I shared bread with," Margaret said firmly. "And if she has been taking food, maybe it's because she's desperate enough to risk everything rather than starve. Give me a chance to handle this without bloodshed." Mayor Hutchins consulted his pocket watch. "It's near 8 o'clock now. You've got until sunrise, first light. If you're not back with her by then, we're going up there ourselves, and we won't be asking polite questions. And if I can't find her, then you'd better hope we don't either," Tom Bradley said ominously. After the men rode away, Margaret stood on her porch listening to the night sounds of winter, wind through bare branches, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft whisper of falling snow. Somewhere up in those dark canyons, Aiyana was probably preparing for sleep, unaware that her world was about to collapse around her again. Margaret went inside and began gathering supplies for what might be the most important journey of her life. She had maybe 8 hours to find Aiyana and convince her to trust the justice of men who'd already decided she was guilty. The odds weren't good, but the alternative was unthinkable. As she laced up the beautiful moccasins Aiyana had given her, Margaret whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, Christian or otherwise, that she wouldn't be too late to prevent another tragedy born of fear and misunderstanding. Margaret had never climbed Eagle Canyon in winter, and the treacherous ascent through snow-covered rocks quickly taught her why sensible people avoided it. The moccasins Aiyana had given her proved invaluable. Their soft soles gripped the icy stones better than her worn boots ever could, and the fur lining kept her feet warm despite the bitter cold. She followed what she hoped were the right deer trails, guided by instinct and the faint wisps of smoke she occasionally glimpsed above the canyon walls. Her breath came in sharp puffs that crystallized instantly in the frigid air, and more than once she had to stop to rest her burning lungs. When she finally found Aiyana's camp, tucked into a sheltered alcove beneath an overhanging rock face, the eastern sky was already showing the first pale hints of dawn. Aiyana emerged from her small shelter before Margaret could call out, the woman's survival instincts too sharp to miss the approach of another person. She held a knife, but lowered it immediately upon recognizing her visitor. Margaret! Aiyana's voice carried surprise and concern. What brings you to this place in darkness? Are you hurt? I'm fine, but you're in terrible danger, Margaret said, struggling to catch her breath. The townspeople think you've been stealing food. They're coming for you at sunrise with guns and rope. Aiyana's face went very still. I have taken nothing that was not freely given by the earth itself. I know that. But food has gone missing from 2 houses, and they found tracks leading this way. They've already decided you're guilty. And what do you believe? Margaret looked into Aiyana's dark eyes and saw the hurt there, not at the accusation, but at the possibility that Margaret might doubt her. I believe you'd starve before you'd steal, but belief won't stop what's coming. Aiyana was quiet for a moment, then gestured for Margaret to follow her into the small shelter. Inside, Margaret saw how carefully Aiyana had arranged her meager possessions, dried foods hanging from the ceiling, a small fire pit ventilated to minimize smoke, sleeping furs arranged for maximum warmth. Everything spoke of someone trying to survive with dignity intact. You risked much to warn me, Aiyana said, offering Margaret a cup of pine needle tea. Why? Because you're my friend. Because what happened to your husband was wrong, and what they're planning now is wrong too. And what do you propose we do? I cannot outrun horses in this snow. Margaret had been thinking about this during her climb. Come back with me. Face them directly. Tell your side of the story before they can act on their assumptions. You think they will listen to the words of an Indian woman? I think they might listen if you're standing beside me when you speak them, and I think Pastor Williams, for all his faults, believes in proper justice. If we can get you a fair hearing— Aiyana studied Margaret's face in the flickering firelight. You would stand beside me, even knowing what it might cost you. I've already paid most of that cost. And Sean always said that sometimes you have to choose between being safe and being right. A slow smile crossed Aiyana's features. Your husband was wise. Very well, I will come with you. But first, there is something you must know. She moved to a corner of the shelter and withdrew a bundle wrapped in deer hide. Inside were strips of jerky, dried berries, and roots that Margaret didn't recognize. I did not take the food from your neighbors' houses, Aiyana said carefully. But I know who did. Who? A young warrior from my band, my husband's nephew, Standing Wolf. He has been watching the town, trying to work up courage to rescue me. He believes I am being held prisoner or am too weak to leave on my own. Margaret felt a cold understanding settle in her stomach. He's been taking food to help you survive. Yes, and leaving it where I would find it, along with other supplies. He means well, but his actions have created this danger for both of us. Where is he now? Close. He never camps far from me. Aiyana's expression grew troubled. If your townspeople come hunting with guns and they encounter Standing Wolf instead of me, there'll be bloodshed, Margaret finished. We have to warn him. But as they emerged from the shelter, they found they were too late for warnings. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, accompanied by the harsh voices of men who'd worked themselves into the mood for violence. Worse, from another direction came the soft sound of someone moving through the underbrush, someone trying to remain hidden while getting closer to investigate the commotion. "Standing wolf," Aiyana breathed, recognizing the pattern of movement. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, all of them ending badly. Then she remembered something Aiyana had said during their first conversation, about the Creator testing hearts by sending those in need to our doors. "Do you trust me?" she asked suddenly. "With my life. Then follow my lead, and pray your nephew has enough sense to stay hidden until this is over." They made their way down the canyon path, Aiyana walking slightly behind Margaret in a gesture that could be interpreted as either surrender or dignity, depending on the observer's prejudices. They met the search party halfway down, just as the sun crested the canyon rim and bathed the snow-covered rocks in golden light. Mayor Hutchins pulled up short when he saw them, his face showing surprise that his ultimatum had actually worked. "Well, I'll be damned. You found her." "I found her," Margaret agreed, "and she has something to say." Pastor Williams urged his horse forward. "Speak then, woman, where's the food you stole?" Aiyana stepped forward with the same calm dignity she'd shown at Margaret's cabin. "I have taken no food from your houses, but I know who has and why." She told them about Standing Wolf, about his misguided attempts to help her, about the cultural misunderstanding that had led to what they saw as theft. As she spoke, Margaret watched the faces of the men, seeing doubt creep into some expressions, stubborn disbelief in others. "You expect us to believe this convenient story?" Tom Bradley demanded. "About some phantom Indian we've never seen?" "You have seen him," Aiyana replied calmly. "He is there now in the rocks above us, trying to decide whether to fight 8 armed men to protect someone he believes is in danger." Every head turned upward, hands moving toward weapons. For a heartbeat, the canyon held nothing but tense silence. Then Standing Wolf emerged from concealment, moving with the fluid grace of someone raised to hunt and fight in terrain like this. He was young, maybe 25, with the lean build of a warrior and eyes that missed nothing. He carried a rifle but held it pointed downward, ready but not openly threatening. He spoke in Lakota, his voice carrying across the canyon, and Aiyana responded in the same language. The exchange was brief, but seemed to carry layers of meaning. "He says he will answer for his actions," Aiyana translated. "He took the food to help me survive, not knowing it would bring danger to the white woman who had shown me kindness. He offers to work for your families without payment, to make restitution for what he took." The men exchanged glances, the situation suddenly more complex than they'd expected. A flesh-and-blood person offering to make amends was harder to hate than a faceless threat in the darkness. Pastor Williams spoke first. "How do we know this isn't some trick? How do we know there aren't more of them hidden in these rocks?" Standing Wolf seemed to understand English better than he spoke it, because he responded by setting his rifle carefully on the ground and raising his empty hands. Then he called out something in his own language, and his voice echoed off the canyon walls with no answering calls. "He is alone," Aiyana confirmed, "and he offers himself as surety for peace between our peoples." Margaret stepped forward then, knowing this was the crucial moment. "Gentlemen, we have a choice. We can see this as an opportunity to build understanding, or we can let fear drive us to actions we'll regret. But I'll tell you this. Aiyana saved my life during the blizzard, sharing what little she had, and now her nephew offers to work off a debt he didn't have to admit to. That sounds like honor to me." Mayor Hutchins was quiet for a long moment, weighing politics against conscience. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, we'll try it your way, Pastor, but there will be conditions." The negotiations that followed were tense but productive. Standing Wolf would work for the families he'd taken from, under supervision, until the debt was repaid. Aiyana would be allowed to remain in the area through winter, but would move on come spring, and Margaret would serve as a sort of liaison, responsible for ensuring both sides kept their agreements. As the men prepared to ride back to town, Pastor Williams approached Margaret privately. "You've put yourself in a difficult position, standing up for them like this." "Maybe, but it's the position my conscience demands." "Well," he said grudgingly, "perhaps there's something to be said for following one's conscience even when it's inconvenient." 3 days later, Margaret woke to find her porch transformed. During the night, someone had covered the entire structure with beautiful buffalo hide, tanned to butter-soft perfection and decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light like jewels. The covering would keep snow and wind from her door through the rest of the winter, a gift more valuable than gold in the harsh frontier climate. But more than that, Margaret understood it as a symbol. In Lakota culture, Aiyana later explained. The buffalo hide represented the generosity of the earth itself, the willingness of the sacred to provide for those in need. By covering Margaret's porch with it, Standing Wolf's band, which had arrived quietly in the night and departed the same way, was honoring her as someone who embodied that same generosity. Word of the buffalo hide gift spread through Willow Creek quickly, and reactions were mixed. Some saw it as vindication of Margaret's faith in Aiyana's character. Others viewed it with suspicion, wondering what obligations such a gift might carry. But Margaret simply saw it as what it was, a recognition that kindness, offered freely and without expectation of return, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. As she sat on her newly sheltered porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Sean's death, a sense of belonging to something larger than her own survival. The bread she had shared with a hungry stranger had been returned 100-fold, not just in material gifts, but in the knowledge that friendship could transcend any boundary that fear and prejudice might try to erect. And in the warmth of that understanding, Margaret O'Sullivan found a new way to honor her husband's memory, by continuing to walk others home, one act of compassion at a time.